So, hello everyone. Welcome to today's Blue Mission Atlantic and Arctic Weekly Hour. My name is Ana Faria. I'm a member of the Blue Mission AA at the Air Center. And today's Weekly Hour will be focused on active restoration of marine ecosystems. And it actually builds on the insights from our previous webinar on passive restoration. If you didn't join us 2 weeks ago, you have the opportunity to watch that webinar on our YouTube channel. Our panel of experts today includes Oliver Wilson from the Marine Institute in Ireland and Sebastian Kopf from the Norwegian Institute for Water Research. They bring their expertise in ocean governance and marine conservation, and they play a key role supporting the BlueMissionAA Work Package on mission governance and implementation in the Atlantic and Arctic. So thank you, Oliver and Sebastian, for organizing this second webinar on innovative solutions, governance solutions to support Atlantic and Arctic Lighthouse. I will now pass on to Sebastian, who is a great moderator. So please, we can now start.
The Atlantic and Arctic oceans are vital to our planet, nurturing ecosystems that provide life and support for millions of people. But these oceans are facing unprecedented challenges. Climate change, pollution, and overfishing threaten their health and our future. The BlueMissionAA project is stepping in to tackle those challenges, with a clear mission to restore and protect our waters.
BlueMissionAA is an EU-funded project under the Restore Our Ocean and Waters by 2030 mission dedicated to safeguarding our European seas and rivers. With a singular focus on protecting and restoring marine and coastal ecosystems, BlueMissionAA is leading the charge to build a connection hub to support the mission implementation in the Arctic and Atlantic basin.
The objective of BlueMissionAA is clear: to engage every organization and individual we can to reach the goal of protecting 30% of marine ecosystems with 10% under strict protection. This ambitious goal is not just about numbers. It's about ensuring health and resilience of the ocean for future generations. To achieve these goals, BlueMissionAA has structured its effort around 5 core activities: build and mobilize governance frameworks, develop and deploy a comprehensive monitoring and reporting framework, develop a catalog of innovation solutions and a dynamic entrepreneurial innovation ecosystem, and engage and empower citizens to contribute to the mission and boost society uptake of new solutions.
Thank you and welcome to today's session. This session is about passive restoration, if you think about last week, but today it's not about passive, it's about active restoration. And I'm very happy to be sitting here today with Oliver Wilson from the state agency in Ireland responsible for marine research. Welcome, Oliver. Oliver will share his screen in a minute, and I'm welcoming you all, and it's a pleasure to see that so many of you are attending today. So as mentioned last week, and 2 weeks ago, last time we have spoken about passive restoration. Today we want to bridge from passive to active. The objectives of this webinar are, as you can see here on the screen, which is why I'm going to let you read this for a minute. It is again about the Atlantic and Arctic Lighthouse, the biggest lighthouse, one could say, from the polar region in the north down to the Azores. So a huge region about restoring, in particular about active restoration of these huge areas. It's about supporting the development of specific options for such an effective governance. And we are seeking 2 outputs in particular of the combined webinar from 2 weeks ago and today. This is about framing the new approaches and structures that are associated particularly with governance and management. We will talk further about what this means, what is the difference between governance and management today. And we focused try to have this as key message, as key take-home message, passive restoration, and particularly today active restoration, about marine ecosystems and biodiversity restoration within the Atlantic and Arctic. I'm very happy again that Oliver Wilson is here, representing the Irish state agency responsible for marine research, and I'm handing over to you, Oliver. Welcome, and please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, and thank you for everyone's time for attending the webinar. As Sebastian outlined, our last webinar was on passive restoration, and I just wanted to give a very brief reminder of the subjects we covered. So we discussed our new proposals around new governance frameworks associated with passive restoration, and the rationale for the change, the principles for our change, and the steps to implement enduring governance change. Those discussion areas were around ecosystem-based management, policy alignment, and evidence-supported decision-making. These are common threads, both for the passive and for the active, but just as Sebastian mentioned and as Anna mentioned in the introduction, they will be able to you'll be able to access those via the online resources such as YouTube, if you want to go back and have another look. But for today, we're going to be talking about active restoration. Sorry. And so before we get started, I just wanted to emphasize that restoration, the terminology we'll be using today, and so we will be using restoration in terms of passive and active. And so the insert I have put in there for you is just identifying that the nature restoration law defines restoration as the process of actively or passively assisting the recovery of an ecosystem. Now, we are aware that there is some scientific discussion around the terminology of restoration and indeed active or passive. Our project is focused and has objectives through the Mission Ocean that refers to restoration, and we're using the concepts of active and passive in our last two webinars, and so that's the terminology that I'll be using moving forward, just for clarity. But we are aware of the different discussions in this space. So the question really is, why are we talking about active restoration? And at the outset, I want to just discuss with you the recognition of the role of active restoration. So there's a growing recognition for the need for active restoration to complement passive. EU reports, impact assessment reports associated with nature restoration law identified that there's been a paradigm shift with an increased focus on active restoration, and that these integration of active and passive strategies are seen as complementary in terms of meeting international commitments moving forward, both in terms of biodiversity commitments, climate commitments, and arguably supporting food security and energy security moving forward. Active restoration is increasingly being acknowledged and referenced both at a regional level through forums such as OSPAR, as well as through the EU in terms of nature restoration law, as well as nationally through national plans such as in France, Spain, Norway, or indeed Portugal and Ireland, for example. As just a few. It's just setting the scene of why we're focusing on active restoration.
So Oliver, let me ask you a question here. You write here also, and you said active restoration is referenced in this area in the Atlantic and Arctic legislation. Side note also to Gordon Dalton here, Canary Islands are included in it. That's correct. It's not only until the Azores, it goes further down until the Canary Islands. Thank you very much for pointing that out. Oliver, a question to you. What role, if it's referenced in both Atlantic and Arctic legislation, what role does active restoration play?
I think it's a pertinent question, Sebastian, because historically the EU has actually prioritised passive marine restoration strategies. So historically, the focus has been on marine protected areas, MPAs, over active restoration efforts. Arguably, some of that prioritisation relates to the fact that restoration projects have previously had short project durations, small restoration areas, arguably the lack of standardization protocols, data collection, monitoring, which limited their scalability and generalization in order to meet some of the obligations. And so historically, the conservation policies has focused on that more passive. But with the advent of the new nature restoration law, especially in the European context, and the development of new ecosystem-based approaches in Norway, there's an increased growing recognition and utilization of active restoration and the demonstration of that hybrid approach of utilizing passive and active in the same space. The benefits of using active restoration are multifaceted. Notably, you can demonstrate changes. From a societal perspective, people can be engaged with the process, taking ownership and stewardship that doesn't necessarily happen in a passive context. And when we talk about sustainable finance and governance around enduring projects, there's an element of being able to build on a return on investment in an active restoration project. You can do it in passive, but it's more demonstrable in active restoration projects.
So let me pressure you a little bit on this here. Also take into account that our audience might want to hear also like a clear answer on that. Given all those positives that passive restoration has, you have talked now both active and passive restoration both appear to have quite a lot of benefits. Can you go a bit more in detail about, like, given those positives that active restoration has, why that passive restoration has why not? Sorry, let me do this again. Given all the positives, why not only do active restoration? Why do both?
It's a very valid point. I think it comes down to practicalities, logistics, practicalities, cost. Active restoration is more costly. It requires that human intervention, that interaction, action from individuals, and so that's a cost of time, resources, equipment across the board. So there is a trade-off there. Then interestingly, there's a trade-off of costs, realities, and practicalities. Then interestingly, there's an ethical aspect. Some would argue that a passive restoration is more positive because you're leaving nature alone to do what it needs to do, whereas with an active restoration project, you could make a change but potentially have unintended consequences. And so therefore you have to be careful in terms of restoration plans and make sure that they're well aligned with objectives and targets, and you're monitoring them, which is very much what the nature restoration law is from an EU perspective, and the new national plans that are being developed and reviewed from different states are actually looking at. I would argue comments at a recent Arctic Frontiers conference highlighted why we need active restoration. The comment was made, if everybody moves out of the Arctic, will the Arctic stay the same or improve based on just passive restoration? And the assertion at the meeting, which I would agree with, is that it's going to continue to change due to outside influences such as climate change. And therefore, we do need active. But I think it's a case of getting that trade-off, optimizing. And we'll come back to the optimizing in terms of some of the ideas that we're promoting as part of our project moving forward. So advancing the questions that you were kind of asking, Sebastian, in terms of why we've been focusing on active or passive. Well, actually, our work to date has actually focused on conducting a baseline study. And if people go back and look at the previous presentation, you'll see the work that was done around baseline studies of legal frameworks and authorities across the Atlantic and Arctic For today's presentation, I want to highlight that we worked across 6 case studies within the Atlantic and Arctic to review the governance at a project level. So we were looking at it in terms of the figure to your right-hand side. I'm talking about the assessment, the different components, the assessment from component 1 all the way through to monitoring and evaluation. And we're identifying golden nuggets at each of these components. So for example, in the assessment, we identified these across these 6 case studies, the golden nuggets of projects that conduct gap analyses or pilot site assessments prior to their planning and design phase. Then as part of the design phase, they have embedded research and they're interdisciplinary by design. And then, for example, in the implementation stage, there's just a partnering with local stakeholders and an investment in training programs, whilst the ongoing managing focused on the outcomes and was very impact focused, and took an approach with the monitoring and evaluation that planned for the evaluation at the earlier stages, so utilizing both qualitative and quantitative data. So our project has highlighted there's a lot of good things happening, consistent with our baseline study of the legal frameworks and authorities. But what it does highlight that there's lots of strands that need to be woven together. And whilst the golden nuggets highlighted that there is positive stuff, it's identified that actually it's not well represented in historical legislation. Now, obviously, there's been significant changes and there's ongoing processes at present that will hopefully change that moving forward. But one obvious factor was about the lack of vertical integration and horizontal integration, which comes out in terms of restoration projects becoming very siloed. And so they lack the connection to the bigger picture. Now, what's apparent from our work to date is that actually we've highlighted where projects have been set up with objectives and targets that aren't necessarily linking into the bigger picture in terms of an actual impactful change. And I'll come back to this point about impact briefly later on. As I outlined, these are the first 2 steps that we've done, step 1 and step 2, and currently this webinar is part of a process of step 3. And as part of step 3 of our project, we're building on those golden nuggets from the case studies and those assessments of the baseline studies. As part of step 3, we're looking at these 5 steps, essentially looking to develop a systematic insight using PESTLE analyses and then driving through to strategic planning. And the strategic planning is essentially where we are going to start providing actionable work streams and proposals for advancing through the European Commission or proposed to the European Commission. And lastly, just in terms of summarizing the work that we've done today, I just wanted to identify that we are currently making more of these, but we have these available and they'll be going up onto our website and through our social medias. Essentially, we've created lots of reports in our project, likewise our work package partners and across the whole BlueMissionAA project. But we're starting to use a new approach whereby we produce, instead of people necessarily having to read a long report, they can look at these podcast approaches. I don't know, Sebastian, you might have a couple of points you might want to raise on that or discuss.
That is correct. A podcast normally is at least 2 persons. As we are here 2 persons, and I want to stress the opportunity that our viewers have today, that you have today, to pressure Mr. Oliver Wilson about the things that he's saying today. So if you have any questions, and even if you don't have any questions, think about some questions and then put those questions that you think about in the chat, or rather even better in the Q&A box that you see down on your screen. If you're on YouTube, you can't do that, but you're happy to also email us afterwards, and then we're happy to respond. You will find information like this on the website Blue Mission Atlantic Arctic. So BlueMissionAA.eu. Can't remind again, please think about your questions that you want to raise. We can have them either if they fit directly during the presentation, if Oliver allows. Otherwise, we can have them at the end. The best way to do so is in a Q&A. Now back to you, Ollie.
Thanks, Sebastian. As per the presentation around passive, because we've gone through the same process with step 1 and step 2, we've identified the same key discussion areas throughout. We had an expert panel that took on all of our observations under the baseline study and from the individual assessments of projects, restoration projects that I just briefly discussed, the golden nuggets. So we highlighted 3 different discussion areas: ecosystem-based management, policy alignment, and evidence-supported decision-making. So this is a summary of what we're discussing as part of the project, and this is what's happening through step 3 with engagement processes such as this webinar and one-to-one meetings where we've engaged stakeholders. As Sebastian said, by all means put your questions in, but equally if you feel free to reach out, post this if you don't want to ask questions now, and we're more than open to have one-to-one discussions about what we're proposing and building on collective knowledge from years of experience across the whole of the Atlantic and Arctic and beyond. And so we're looking to redefine the management units to be more ecologically based, so looking to be ecosystem based management, and then redefine to more of an impact driven approach as opposed to necessarily a percentages approach, which is currently what's happening. And then in terms of policy alignment, looking to build on that coherence, the policy coherence across the board, whether that be in more of a soft manner in terms of a collegial approach between states, or a more formalized manner using existing structures within states or within regional bodies such as the EU or OSPAR, for example. And then the move to making sure that we've got very clear standardized terminology and use of reporting and monitoring. So it's a data-driven decision-making or evidence-supported decision-making process. In terms of this charting a new course, I just want to emphasize the strategic direction. So we're talking about moving to an ecosystem-based approach focused on biodiversity units, i.e. the ecosystems as opposed to the EEZs. And again, because it's been such a topical development, that's why I keep referring back to the nature restoration law. And obviously in the Atlantic and Arctic, it will have significant impact in terms of how it's implemented moving forward for member states, but also for non-member states in terms of how the interaction in terms of transboundary. We keep coming back to it because taking an ecosystem-based approach means that we will have ecosystems that are transboundary and that need to be managed as such. But principally what I wanted to highlight by inserting this text here is actually the restoration measures a focus about habit types listed. So there is already an ecosystem-based approach, but what it identifies, and if you refer back to I should say, previous webinar, you'll highlight that moving from EEZs to ecosystem units isn't straightforward. The ecosystem units used by different states don't necessarily line up. The IC's unit integrated ecosystem assessments don't necessarily align, for example, with the Norwegian large marine ecosystems, and then nor do they necessarily perfectly align in terms of the way the nature restoration law is talking about active and passive restoration in terms of the habitat types. And so that's that standardization, that evidence-based management, where we do need to get an agreement on the management unit and a standardization approach.
Ollie, may I ask you a question here?
Yeah, go ahead.
To have our viewers understand this better, and also like to have me understand this better, why can't we base management on percentage coverage and align with good environmental status? Why do we need to shift from impact? This goes like, at least I understood you, we need to shift that way. Can you explain why we do need to do that?
Yeah, it's a good point. We're making this shift to an ecosystem-based approach, and as you've highlighted, Sebastian, on the previous slide, I talked about the fact that we're going to be moving, or we're proposing a move to an impact as opposed to a percentage cover. And to emphasize this, you can actually see in the nature restoration law that the push is to move to good condition. And for the marine ecosystems, that's by 2030, the first target is at 30% of the total area of groups 1 to 6 of the habitat types. And that good condition is linked to the maintaining good environmental status for marine ecosystems, linked to the Water and Marine Strategy Framework Directive. What's of specific note to me is that this 30% they're talking about is not 30% of the whole area, but 30% of the not good condition areas. And actually what they're asking for is that restoration measures are in place, i.e. restoration plans are in place, but they're not specifying what has to change. They're specifying what has to change is at a minimum. So the minimum they're specifying is it has to move from whatever the status is now to a good environmental status. But the reference is always back to the good environmental status based on the threshold values and the indicators from the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. It raises questions to my mind about the potential for a shifting baseline, and that we are only moving our biodiversity back to the point of we have agreed indicators and threshold values. It highlights the inconsistency between states in terms of the indicators and the thresholds that they're using. And it will only ever move to a percentage cover, but it won't look to optimize our actions to get the best return on investment, our best optimization of resources and space by actually setting clear targets. Now, if you look at climate change goals, we had a clear target of not going beyond 1.5 of pre-industrial figures. We don't have that in the biodiversity space, as I discussed at the last webinar. And specifically when we talk about active and passive, we should be looking at setting up restoration plans, whether it be passive and in this case active, where when we are taking an action, we know, for example, that this is the baseline biodiversity that we have currently in this particular restoration site, and that we are seeking to, at a minimum, meet good environmental status, but actually we should be demonstrating our impact by what biodiversity we can increase through that active restoration. So it's a change from just thinking about it in terms of we feel we've been successful by putting a restoration project in to cover an area, but actually changing it to we feel successful when we've put restoration projects in that demonstrate an increase in biodiversity or an increase in ecosystem function. And so I think the key here is that we need to be realistic. We're not talking about getting rid of percentages, but we are looking at about augmenting them, adding to what is already there by adding another layer of targets that are a bit more tangible and very consistent with how we take approaches in other spaces, such as energy, for example, that states have commitments to produce X amount of more energy. We don't talk about it in terms of how much wind farm that they need to create, the space they need to occupy. We talk about it as a tangible outcome. And I think we should be talking the same in terms of biodiversity. And hence, we are proposing a shift to impact-based targets as opposed to percentages. But I think it's a very valid question.
Thank you for the answer. Kind reminder to all audience again to put your questions either in the Q&A in the chat. You can also send them directly to us in the chat if you don't want them to be displayed publicly in Zoom. So just a kind reminder, send us the question, and handing the floor over to you again, Oliver.
Thanks, Sebastian. So the next part of charting a new course from our perspective is looking at the legal framework, and so balancing the international obligations through structured trade-offs. And the trade-offs that we're talking about here, I'll come on to in the subsequent slide, but we're looking at that policy coherence, how we can move to a reality of shifting from research projects to innovation to business as usual, and having it potentially either done in a collegial soft power, soft governance manner, or is in terms of hard governance, in terms of actual changes to Marine Statutory Framework Directive or changes to Common Fisheries Policy to increase recognition. Now, again, this comes back to our point that we are very conscious of there's lots of moving pieces currently, including a review of the Common Fisheries Policy and discussions around the Ocean Pact within the EU. And obviously there's lots of changing discussions in non-EU party states, including development of new research plans and new assessments around ecosystem-based approaches. But one of the key things we are looking at is how to integrate this mountains to sea approach. And this policy coherence is something that's been very much pushed by the EU. If you look at the Oceans Pact, it talks about this. If you look at the letter that was sent to the Commissioner, it also emphasised the push for competitiveness and for policy coherence. So we're looking to align our proposals so they are realistic, but actually move our approaches to be more meaningful, more accountable, and more transparent moving forward. So in terms of my comment earlier about the process in which we would implement it to make change, in terms of having an evidence-supported decision-making process, we first off, as I mentioned, the shift in terms of defining the ecosystem boundaries and the requirement for standardization, then that need for baseline mapping, and so that's then we can determine the impact, and so that's number 3 in terms of setting impact-driven targets, and then that's at a regional level, as well as then subsequently to that adding sectoral overlays that actually account for the fact that we've got social, cultural and economic considerations that need to be taken into account and trade-offs that need to be made at a regional level. So we're suggesting it happens at a regional level first, and that we also add in biodiversity and sectoral evaluations for the current status, on top of which we then need to allow for climate change and to put predictive monitoring in there. I was just recently at the MPA Europe Symposium, and they identified the need for the climate change modelling, even in just terms of connectivity. And that's where active restoration could play a huge part in identifying new sites that, if we actively restored it, may improve the connectivity and therefore the resilience of particular species due to climate change. And so therefore we are not making decisions for now, but we're making decisions for 10, 15, 20 years into the future. And then the process here being that decision making happens at the appropriate levels and that we've got clear roles and responsibilities. But from a active restoration perspective, I just wanted to emphasize this decision tree. And so this is from a paper in Restoration Ecology from Chasden et al. It was published in 2021. And so it just identifies that as part of this process of this impact-driven target setting, we will have to make decisions about where it is appropriate to put in passive or active restoration. And these are the sort of decision trees that we should be using. And these decision trees are those that will identify where we get our best, and my terminology here is return on investment. And when I say investment, I'm not talking about in a monetary sense. I'm talking about in a biodiversity, a social, cultural, economic context. And so much bigger than just what would commonly be used as a monetary return on investment. So it's just key that when we do the impact target driven, accounting for their recognition in the nature restoration law of active and passive working complementary to each other, we will have to make decisions of where it is best to put passive and where we think we could get the best biodiversity improvements, the optimization of our activities, and make them the active restoration sites. But making sure that the governance structures are such that there's a recognition of MPAs, which is much more embedded in EU, regional, EU, and national laws, whereas there's a lot less recognition and legal recognition of restoration, active restoration sites. Commonly, lots of these restoration sites are scientific sites, and being transferred and having a legal basis within a holistic marine spatial planning approach, which accounts for mountains to sea approach as well, is what's needed moving forward, or we consider to be needed moving forward. It's something that we're going to promote as part of our proof of concept idea, which I'll come onto shortly. And then lastly, the people. I mean, all of this is ultimately driven, undertaken by people, and we need to make sure that we bring people along with us. That's why, as part of our process from now to the end of our project, we're talking about the theory of change and how we can bring people with us. We have the early adopters, likely the people that are on this call, early adopters or innovators, and it's about how we bring the large majorities along with us. And so to do that, we are promoting a top-down governance at a regional level, but then a bottom-up hybrid at a national level approach. And the sea parliaments that we're discussing is so that you can bring in all different stakeholders and address intergenerational representation. So you make sure you have youth at the table as well, and they need to have a strong voice moving forward. We aren't planning for 2 years down the time, we plan for much longer. Now, the timing aspect identifies a paradox of urgency, essentially. We have a need to act, but the results in which we're going to see we're not going to see them for a long period of time. So we have to make our decision making much longer term. Now, you could arguably question, why are we now looking to make big changes that might slow down action? And that's that trade-off that we find with people at a local level who want to do something straight away, to feel like they have stewardship. The problem that we see, or the challenge that we have to overcome, is that we have to overcome the need for action and for doing the right thing. And ultimately, there's never a wrong time to do the right thing. And so we feel that a change is needed here, that we can still implement these percentage coverages, and we'll come on to the timeframes that we're talking about, but we can still make change, but make a sequential change and make sure that everybody's coming along together and they're integrated together. So we do get this vertical and horizontal integration of approaches, and we're all pulling in the same direction in terms of meeting our new strategic direction, being ecosystem-based approach and impact-driven. So related to that, I just wanted to summarize in terms of where our current thinking is in terms of next steps. So from a project perspective, we have deliverable commitments, and they'll be produced in the middle of this year. One report proposing new governance work streams and ideas and architectures for the Atlantic, and then one report on the Arctic as well. Same report in terms of work streams, proposals, and architecture moving forward. And there will be synergies and interconnections between the two, noting if we're moving, as we're proposing, moving to the ecosystem-based approaches with ecosystems as the management unit, there will naturally be a transboundary connection. And then as part of those deliverables, we're looking at future-focused proposals, not a proposal, but future-focused work streams that will be highlighted in our reports as part of this project. And that's essentially our proof of concept ideas and associated policy briefs, essentially leading on from the work that I've discussed so far today. Sebastian.
Thank you. I do have a question. Actually, I do have 3 questions for you here. I'm going to ask you one question, then I'm going to address our lovely audience, and then you have time to answer. My question to you is, you provided the audience with a lot of information now. what are the 3 most important points about what you are proposing here? So what are the key points that you are proposing here? What is the key take-home message? You got 20 seconds, 10 seconds to think about this while I'm addressing the audience, our lovely audience. Kind reminder again to send us your questions. I have already forwarded some of them to Oliver, who is doing multitasking on the background. Please send them to us, preferably via the Q&A part of this webinar. If you have further questions, please don't hesitate to send them to us also via email. Again, you can find us under www.BlueMissionAA for Atlantic Arctic.eu. BlueMissionAA.eu. Back to you, Oliver, with the question about there has been so much information here. What are your 3 key points about what you are proposing?
Thanks, Sebastian. I appreciate there's a lot of information there for people, and just to re-emphasize, if anyone wants to get in contact, please do with Sebastian, myself, or anyone from Blue Mission AA, and we'll happily talk about this and discuss people's ideas and viewpoints. So I guess the key things that I would like people to take home from this, in terms of what we are thinking, we are very much pushing a shift to ecosystem approach as the base management unit for ecosystem-based management moving forward. So the first point, utilization of ecosystems as our management unit for ecosystem-based management. The second point would be impact focused. So building upon the percentage targets that we have currently, but adding in very much impact focused so that we can see demonstrable changes of our actions or demonstrable changes in biodiversity, and linking that in terms of accountability and transparency of our actions. So we can make sure that what we are doing is working and it's moving things in the right direction. And the third point I would just add is that this is a sequential process. We appreciate the urgency. We understand people's frustrations about a lack of movement, but we do believe that we need to utilize some of the functions of government and governance that currently exist. So we're looking, for example, to utilize the next phase of the mission, or indeed the timing around Ocean Pact and the timing around reviews of any of the directives, EU directives, or indeed any of the national review processes.
So let me ask whether I got this right. Your 3 key points, I made some notes here, are first of all, shift to ecosystems as base management unit for ecosystem-based management. That was a long answer, so let me repeat that. Shift to ecosystems as the base management unit.
Correct.
The second point, if I got you right, was a focus on impact.
Correct.
And the third point would be sequential process that utilizes the next phase of the mission. Which begs the question, thank you. I'm happy that I got those 3 right. This then begs the question about how would this be implemented in question? Can you shed some light on your thinking about that? How would that be implemented in practice?
So the intent of our implementation is to use a proof of concept idea, essentially. And so we have the reports that we have to produce as project deliverables, but as part of that, we are developing this proof of concept idea and looking to put up an idea to the Commission as part of our project report of how this could be utilized into the future. And so some of our thinking here relates to an idea that could be taken forward under the next phase of the mission, or an alternative function with a project idea whereby we set up, actually implement some of the things that we've been discussing. So, for example, we actually set up a process within amongst states, I should say, in more of a soft governance context, utilising some of the existing structures, whether that be through the Arctic Council or through the Atlantic Action Plan. And we use those structures to trial a shift in the strategic direction. So that first phase. The next, so that would be about not just changing to changing the management units and the impact approach and targets. And then you're looking at a science advisory phase, again, utilising things that we already have. So for example, we have ICs. They have established working groups is one option. There are obviously alternatives, but we have essentially a science advisory body that provides independent advice. And those steps that I highlighted to the audience earlier about setting a baseline and then putting biodiversity hotspots together and then putting sectoral overlays and putting value on those would be what this science advisory phase would conduct. So a collection of lots of information and data reports, as well as developing standardized terminology, methodologies, and impact assessments. From an active restoration perspective, I think it's important that we do need to develop standardized terminology and approaches as active restorations use more. And then in terms of phase 3 and 4, that's about developing those trade-offs, social cultural trade-offs. And then phase 5 is that inception phase at a national level, the national level and local levels developing both the inception phase. So the idea there being that all the information from phase 1 to 4 would be presented at a national level and people can then consult. And instead of maps being provided where there's already lines on them saying these are the ideal areas, that people actually get the maps as a blank piece of information, so to speak, with all the maps without lines, I should say, and then the consultation process being a co-design process where people can say these are the key areas based on the hotspots that are provided. And so therefore that helps build stewardship at a national level. Now, the key being the distinction between phase 4 and phase 5 is that phase 4 is at that regional level, and that decides the national commitment in terms of that trade-off, both in terms of biodiversity, or maybe it's food security or energy, and then that optimization of passive versus active restoration. And then phase 6 is the implementation. And then across all of these, there's just constant feedback loops. So that's the concept, the proof of concept idea that we're developing at the moment. More than happy, as I say, if there's any people that want to talk about this idea, but we have a range of different ideas in terms of how we might roll this out, more likely in a soft governance sequential process, as I discussed.
You're using words here that might make some of our viewers think about the word paradigm, and particularly paradigm shift. And the second term that might come to mind would be realistic and realist. How do these two terms relate to what you're proposing here? Paradigm shift, realistic approach.
So you're absolutely right. We are that phase 1 on your slides at the moment. It is proposing a paradigm shift. We are asking people to change their thinking to be more ecosystem based and impact focused. So that is absolutely a paradigm shift, and that will change how we consider our marine spatial planning. And that decision phase in phase 4, again, is quite a big shift, because what we're asking states to do is to trade off national obligations when it comes to, for example, biodiversity commitments or energy commitments or food security commitments, and having quite tough decisions at the top level about what a revision of what national commitments are. Not removing current commitments, but more refine them. So, for example, as I discussed in the previous webinar, the CBD talks about protection at a representative level and in a coherent, ecologically coherent manner. And so therefore, what our shift of paradigm means is that if one state potentially has more of an ecosystem that requires more active restoration, or indeed passive, then maybe that burden falls on that state, but then there's an offset with other international burdens. Now, that is a significant shift, and you're right, it may not, from a realistic perspective, this is where we talk about timeframes of urgency versus doing what's ultimately right in the long term, or more effective, I should say, and accountable in the long term. And so recognizing that, we are taking a sequential approach, and the focus of our proof of concept will be largely on biodiversity in the first instance, and the decision for those trade-offs is something that will have to come with time. In terms, once we show people that we can move to an ecosystem-based approach and an impact approach, and then we can start adding those other layers on into the future. But recognizing your query and anticipating actually your people's query about realism, we're proposing in terms of timeframes that you actually count. We develop as part of our project this proof of concept idea in 2025 here, and then the idea being that in 2026, 2023, we're moving into phase 2 of the mission. So this is potentially an opportunity to undertake a proof of concept idea. This does take us up to 2030. So that means the existing commitments at 2030, we're not suggesting throwing those out, but we're suggesting between 2026 and 2030 gives us some development time for this paradigm shift, to prepare ourselves for a paradigm shift in potentially to come in 2030. And then around that 2030, we review the proof of concept idea. And then 2030, 2031, the considering of next steps moving forward for our next set of obligations under biodiversity requirements, moving towards 2050 and the alignment of commitments, for example, related to food security and energy security. And energy commitment is obviously a large one. And then, just because we've been talking about the nature restoration plans, I just put in some additional dates that we are bearing in mind. So, for example, in 2032, we have to review our nature restoration plans, and then again in 2042. So, if we were to utilize 2026, 2030 as a period of gearing ourselves up to take that leap, to take that paradigm shift, we could not have to change any of the direction of travel. So we would still have to meet these percentage coverages, but know that by 2030 we're going to then move to more of an impact focused. So we have the coverage, but we're going to be making it more impact focused. Then when it comes to 2032, we will have a review of our nature restoration plans anyway, as required through the nature restoration law, and indeed nationally other non-members will be reviewing their marine spatial plans, for example, as well as their water framework, marine strategy framework directives. All of these directives will be reviewed at some stage. And so if we can prepare ourselves to be ready for that paradigm shift. And so that's how we're trying to be realistic. We're taking a sequential approach. And I suspect what we need to do is to bring people along with us. And so to do that, it will be about doing this in a coalition of the willing in the first instance in the Atlantic and Arctic. And as we develop that coalition of the willing and between different states, we can then demonstrate its usefulness. And then maybe we're moving from a soft governance solution into a more hard governance, hardwired solution that goes into directives moving forward. But I think we have to be realistic about what we can achieve in the short term. But equally, we have to acknowledge the urgency. So that's why we're not suggesting we're stopping in terms of all of the things that are already underway. But we do have actually, I think the timing is right now with the review of with the Ocean Pact, with the upcoming reviews of different directives, as well as the new nature restoration law and people having to develop these anyway from an EU perspective, as well as the shift in thinking in some of the Arctic states about ecosystem-based approach. So we have an opportunity where states are going to have to meet their international obligations, but we can now take some time to make sure that we are ready for the next phase. Thanks.
Thank you, Oliver. I do have some follow-up questions, and this is a nice timeline that you pointed out here from 2025, which is this year, until 2042. Once you have closed the presentation, I would go on about a few of those take-home messages that you want to convey. Before we do so, and before you have closed the when you have closed the presentation, I want to address our audience again to please send us any questions that you might have. I have, in the meantime, sent Oliver a few questions. I would start with question number 1. Are you ready, Oliver?
Yeah, ready and raring to go, Sebastian.
The take-home messages. Question number 1. All the first 3 are about active versus passive. The key take-home messages. First of all, what is the difference between active and passive restoration?
So active has an element of human intervention, essentially, whereas passive is we're leaving nature to itself. So passive relies on removing pressures, then leaving nature to go through its natural processes to go back to whatever the new equilibrium might be. Now, I think people should be, and I'm sure we've got lots of experts on this call, but I can't see everyone's name, but you can't expect it necessarily to restore back to where it was before, but it will just naturally go through natural processes, whereas active, human direction, human intervention, whether it's planting, reseeding, the development of new substrate, for example.
Thank you. I appreciate the conciseness of your answer. Also, please, a concise answer to the second question. Why would one choose active restoration over passive restoration?
Passive, by its very nature, is going to be slow. It follows the natural processes. It's taken a long time for us to be in the situation we are now. It will take a long time for natural processes. In some places, some will be quicker. But as a general rule, active measures are going to speed up the recovery quicker and help rebuild critical habitats and meet our international obligations, as well as address the challenges we face.
I know 2 weeks ago you have also mentioned funding. I have some more question about this and a transition to that, which is question number 3. What are the main costs? What are the main benefits of active restoration?
So in terms of costs, labor, capacity building, ongoing monitoring and enforcement. Now, arguably, monitoring and enforcement is required for passive as well as active, but probably a higher cost associated with active projects as a general rule. And then in terms of benefits, just that quicker ecological recovery and the stronger resilience. We have the All Atlantic Research Alliance, which is very focused on coastal resilience. Now, an active restoration project has the ability to support coastal resilience in a much quicker manner in terms of nature-based solutions, which is very much a focus of the All Atlantic Research Alliance and the associated coordination project Oceano. But that can be done through active restoration projects, whereas passive restoration is going to take a lot longer.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Over to a very important part, which is funding. You talked a little bit about this last time. So we have received a question which goes along the following lines. It's about the basics about project funding, about program funding. Can you tell us a little bit about basically the 3 main sources of funding for restoration projects as it stands now, according to your knowledge?
So based on my knowledge, the restoration projects will primarily be conducted through government grants. Now, government grants aren't going to be finite. We are going to need to look at alternatives long term, but they're a huge supporter. Private sector sponsorship or funding through companies, or indeed non-governmental organisations or foundations, so philanthropic work with grants, for example. The key with all of these, though, is usually with restoration projects, the funding stops at the end of the project, and therefore there is no ongoing funding source, and therefore restoration projects can get into trouble for actually not being able to establish an enduring legacy moving forward. Actually, one other potential funding source is more like crowdsourcing, which is increasingly being used for local restoration projects.
Thank you very much. And a follow-up question to that, or a slight shift from funding then to policy. What policy gaps can active restoration hinder? Maybe also in comparison to passive restoration. So what policy gaps can active restoration hinder?
So I think,
I meant it the other way around. What policy gaps can hinder active restoration? Yes,
I understand. The key one from an active restoration is permitting. It's what we find is that people have to jump through a lot more hoops when they want to add things to the ocean from an active restoration perspective. Okay. And also there's an issue when you have passive, it's usually done through government deciding on particular areas that they want to put aside. Is a bit harder. There's more bureaucracy in terms of site identification, and then also permitting and approvals. Equally, that in terms of jurisdictions, lots of restoration sites are in that coastal zone, and then so we have jurisdictional boundaries that we have to worry about. And then likewise, if it's beyond 12 nautical miles, we have any restoration sites there will come across the common fisheries policy, and the implication of that any of those sort of restoration measures have to be aligned with the common fisheries policy and can't undermine that. So certainly I think active restoration it's harder for active restoration to be well established, but I do think the nature restoration law gives us this avenue here. I think there's actually new projects that are actually looking at marine spatial planning and things like the Marine Plan project, for example, in the European Marine Plan project that's actually produced just recently a very good paper that looked at different frameworks, how to actually improve. Now, what we need to make sure is that it's not just talking about passive, but also active. But there's lots of frameworks that are being developed. For example, ICs themselves are developing lots of frameworks in terms of frameworks for ecosystem advice, and that links to active and active and passive.
Thank you very much. I do have received a message from Anna. Anna will come in a minute and now ask you a question. Anna, please take the floor.
Yes, thank you, Sebastian, and thank you, Oliver, for another such great webinar, this time on active restoration. So I really appreciated that proof of concept and all the phases, the 6 phases you've explained, very informative and very, from my perspective, very well planned. But achieving this good environmental status of habitats, it takes years. So habitat restoration faces several challenges. You have the climate change, you have the invasive species, you have lots of keystone species, loss of genetic diversity. You have so many challenges when you start to restoring habitat to achieve that desired good environmental status. And we're just 5 years from the targets of are you confident that we will be achieving those 30% of restoration? Because it really takes time.
I think it's a really, really good question, a tricky one, but actually I would turn it on its head. So I would change the question in the context, does it matter if we get to 30%? Because probably everyone on this call could get to 30% tomorrow by just drawing some lines that would take just the edge of the EEZ of most countries. And so actually my viewpoint, and which is why we're promoting this impact, is actually it's much long-term thinking. It's much more important to be talking about the impact of our actions. And you're right, restoration doesn't happen overnight, and so we have to be thinking long-term. Now I think that's where our proof of concept idea is making a distinction between what we do now and until 2030. And so we have to do the percentage coverages, and that's what we're legally signed up to do, and we should do. There will be some benefit of that. I'm not suggesting there isn't benefit of that, but I don't think we get our necessarily the optimization or the best return on investment and activity and funding it if we don't take that shift to a longer term view around where are we making the most impact. And it might be that and within 30% we get the impact that we want, or it might be that we need to go beyond the 30%, for example. But until we know what impact our passive and our active restoration is having combined together, I don't think we can determine it. So sorry, I appreciate I've taken a slightly different slant. The other thing, yes, there's urgency for 2030 to meet those international obligations. But I do think long term, if we're going to make this paradigm shift, I'd use a quote from Fulton J. Sheen, which talks about patience is power. So patience is not an absence of action, rather it is timing. It waits on the right time to act for the right principles in the right way. And I think that's where we're pushing a shift to an ecosystem-based approach focused on impact is the right way, the right time to act. We have to be realistic. So there needs probably some patience between now and 2030, during which we still have the existing processes that we adopt and engage with, but we should think about this longer term future. And as I just end on, there's never the wrong time to do the right thing, and patience is power long term.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Oliver. That was a very nice answer. It reflects also my overview, and I think I believe that for most of the audience, it really reflects. We need to be realistic, and we need to make that shift that you've shown us today. So thank you very much, Oliver and Sebastian. Thank you for moderating this session again. I believe we are coming to an end. I'm not sure if we have more questions. I don't think so. So I might now close our session. I'd like to thank again Oliver and Sebastian for such an informative webinar. Thank you everyone for joining us online. 19th of March, actually, with a webinar focused on an active restoration example. We'll be talking about a large restoration plan for Norway's kelp forest. So perfect timing. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thanks, everyone. Thanks.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.